I think we can all agree that the music industry is pretty shady. In fact, I can't think of an example in my lifetime of streaming services or big-name labels making a decision that people approved of. But they do not deserve your sympathy. Above all else, the industry is famous for exploiting artists' creativity and having no remorse to show for it. And one of the most egregious examples of this exploitation is posthumous releases of music, a tactic which has only gotten more popular in the past few decades. I think at this point, most people have a story about an artist that they cared about being puppeteered around in a way that only rubbed salt in the wound. And it's because of that that posthumous albums have become one of the most controversial topics in music. But what I want to do is take an objective look at these albums. Because a lot of this discourse has been carried out online, and we all know that the internet is famous for being rather reactionary and jumping to conclusions. The general consensus has been that posthumous releases are bad, full stop. But part of me wants to see the good in these situations, if there is any, the light at the end of the tunnel, if it's there. We can really only hope that by looking beyond just the music in these albums and looking into the context behind them, that some better intentions reveal themselves. Well, these labels better be crossing their fingers. I get the feeling, either from trauma or just pure anger, most people still remember every modern example of posthumous albums. So I feel it would only be right to start in the past with some examples that people may have forgotten about. Because in order to understand the context around these highly discussed cases like X, Biggie, or Tupac, which we are going to get to, we need to cover where this pattern started first. If anything, just to see what the reasoning behind these albums was back then. Marvin Gaye is definitely in the category of GOAT, and those that don't agree with that at least recognize his name as someone that they respect. I mean, he was a hard musician to hate, but I should probably just cut to the chase. Washington, D.C. native soul singer Marvin Gaye was murdered by his own father by way of 2 gunshots on April 1st of 1984. The court case that followed was infamously frustrating for Gaye's fans, as his father pled guilty to manslaughter and only received 6 years with 5 years probation. Now, in 1982, Marvin had moved from Motown Records to Columbia Records, where he signed a 3-album deal. At the time of his death, he had 2 albums left to make in order to complete this deal with Columbia. So, in more ways than one, Marvin Gaye did not get the conclusion to his story that he deserved as an artist. And so you would think that anyone in Columbia's shoes would do the sensible thing and allow his career to end at least on a neutral note, with his discography matching his vision at least as close as it could. But no, Columbia and Motown worked together to concoct what would go down as Gaye's worst album by far. Motown and Columbia mainly grabbed vocal snippets that he had recorded during previous sessions at either studio, but they also scrapped old and unfinished songs and combed through his personal recordings. By creating a Frankenstein monster of all 3 of these sources, they managed to finish the project. And so it would appear as if they went to unusually great lengths to squeeze Dream of a Lifetime out. But these were all industry standard methods for creating a posthumous album, even for the 1980s. Marvin Gaye would go on to have a few more albums reconstructed for him, but for the most part, that's it. That's the whole story. That's all the context there is for the end of this man's career. And let's be honest, that story speaks for itself. Their only motivation for making the album was to fulfill that contractual obligation, which was only held to such high importance because of Marvin Gaye's uncanny ability to top the charts. Was the album good? No, it was rather shit, and people knew it. This was not some fan service project. This was not a virtuous endeavor. It was thrown together, self-admittedly, to complete the business that they had. But it charted. By God, did it chart. The leading single, Sanctified Lady, reached number 2 on Billboard, and the album itself hit number 8. People missed Marvin Gaye, so they listened to it, regrettably or not. Beyond just a contract, they knew they would profit off of his name and his death. Let's not sugarcoat it. The labels won here. So, fuck it. We could just make another one, and another one, and another one, and another. That was pretty much what the industry concluded from this situation and all the other posthumous albums that came before it. Let me make it clear, 1984 was not the first time a posthumous album was made through unorthodox means. But it certainly was not the last time. If anything, things picked up from here. Big examples from the rest of the 80s and 90s include Miles Davis, John Lennon, Keith Green, Bob Marley, Freddie Mercury, Selena, Rory Gallagher, and many, many more. All examples which are unnervingly similar to Marvin Gaye's. Some had unfinished contracts at their labels, others had greedy families, and some were just failed attempts at a legacy piece for the fans. None of which are good excuses to ruin an otherwise flawless career. What these examples do tell us is that this is a pattern. The artists we are going to cover whose stories take place decades after Marvin Gaye, Miles Davis, or Selena still suffer from these same practices that the industry had in the past. With all that in mind, let's fast forward to the year 2009 when the king of pop, Michael Jackson, died to a drug overdose. Maybe with the exception of John Lennon, Michael Jackson was the biggest musician to die at a young age at this point in history. I mean, no one didn't listen to MJ. This was still the era of the radio, so most young people listened to the same pop artists, and Michael Jackson was the biggest. Also, this was well before any allegations of depravities would come out. This is all to say that people everywhere were devastated about Michael Jackson's death. They were preying on their lucky stars that it was all a hoax and there was a new album in the works. Sony Records was the one in charge of Michael Jackson's music back in 2009, and after his death, they took an entire year to come up with their plan to exploit this widespread emotion. What they eventually came up with was the infamously shitty album, Michael. What a creative name. It's yet another reconstructed mess, except this time it's Michael Jackson's vocals. Vocal demos, unreleased songs, unfinished songs, and it shows. These songs are uncanny, contrived, and just plain bad. Even the album art is tone deaf. Putting all of Michael's achievements and greatest moments onto this one cover implies some sort of bow being tied on his story, some sort of ending to his legacy, and that's just extra insulting. The craziest part about Michael, though, is that the people close to MJ made it clear to Sony Records that Michael, the real person, was a perfectionist and would never have wanted unfinished music to be heard by the public. Even though friends, family, and coworkers were adamant about this, Sony went through with it anyway. While Columbia and Motown had plausible deniability, here, the people making this album knew he would not have wanted it made. But pause for a second. Are we even sure that's Michael Jackson singing? Yeah, apparently, a massive controversy surrounding this album was debate about whether or not the vocals were even Michael Jackson to begin with. Now, before I reveal if these theories are true or not, can we just appreciate the gravity of the situation here? If the speculators are telling the truth, this means that Sony Records not only raked through all of Jackson's old, forgotten material to make a forgettable album, but they also tricked his fans into believing they were hearing Michael when in reality they were hearing a fabricated version of Michael, which would be them contradicting any positive intentions they could lie about having, seeing as the only explanation for that would be to profit off of Michael Jackson's name. These must be rumors. There's no way they actually did that. They did exactly that. And everyone who was in Michael's life did not want them to get away with it. This behavior was brought to the public's attention by way of a thorough lawsuit filed by Michael's estate against Sony, during which they admitted to faking the vocals on Michael. Deplorable. How the Sony Records executives could sleep at night after hearing Michael's own mother say she instantly knew it wasn't his voice is beyond me. So we have Marvin Gaye, who was exploited by his record companies showing zero empathy, and Michael Jackson, who was exploited by his record company showing zero empathy and then laughing about it like a Batman villain. But admittedly, I got so carried away with those frustrating examples that I kind of forgot that we're trying to be objective here. And listen, it's not like I don't want to be. It can be done right. Let's talk about Jeff Buckley, an artist with a textbook cult following, an artist who my chat brings up all the time. His passing strikes a chord with a lot of people, and his music is very close to a lot of people's hearts. A year before his death in 1997, he started working on a new album to follow up his famous studio debut, Grace. He toiled over the quality of the album and worked on perfecting the sound with producer Tom Verlaine. The album was almost done. However, Jeff wasn't totally happy with the versions of the songs that they had. So, right before his passing, him and his band headed back to Memphis to re-record the album. Here is where Sony re-enters the picture. And Jeff's mom. Like we just established, Jeff was not done with the album, but what his band and his own mother didn't know was that they decided to pick up where he left off in classic record label fashion. Their plan was to finish Verlaine's mixing and mastering and then release the album in the state that Buckley wasn't happy with. This probably would have resulted in a similar outcome to Marvin Gaye and MJ's albums. But Jeff's mom didn't take this too kindly. When she found out, she hit them with a cease and desist letter that eventually did get her a compromise. They would release the album with the finished versions of the songs, the versions that Jeff didn't really like. However, a second side of the album would contain the demos that Jeff made in anticipation to reimagine the album in Memphis. Because of this interjection from Jeff's friends and family, critics and fans were able to set aside any moral hang-ups and enjoy these still innovative and beautiful sounds of Jeff's actual music. In simple terms, this was actually Jeff Buckley's music. Those were not Marvin Gaye or MJ's actual music. Sony, this was an easy solution. Okay, so things aren't all bad. Like I said, it can be done right, even though they had to be convinced not to commit another atrocity. The problem is, Sketches for My Sweetheart the Drunk by Jeff Buckley didn't really chart that well, but Michael and Dreams of a Lifetime, they did. In reality, Jeff Buckley didn't really ever chart, so it was easier for Sony to rationalize sacrificing that commercial success for more creative integrity, despite how little they wanted to do it. Yeah, sure, this is an example of a good posthumous album, but if it was up to Sony and the other major labels, they would just keep manufacturing these plastic, commercial, money-printing posthumous albums. But okay, the most modern example that we've looked at is from 2010. That's a whole 15 years ago. Our last hope is to pray that time passing has improved this behavior. I mean, almost every creative industry was massively exploitative in the past. We're much better people nowadays, right? Also, we have the internet now. Labels can't just keep ignoring the negative feedback, right? Things couldn't possibly get worse, right? If you thought the previous examples were bad, allow me to introduce you to the absolute depravity that is the music industry and rap artists in the 2010s and 2020s. Here is where things go from shady to a corporate machine dystopian nightmare. Firstly, it's important to point out the fan-artist dynamic that the rap industry has. Because of a higher focus on lyrical content and sentiments in their music, rappers are generally held very close to people's hearts. If someone feels like a rapper is speaking to issues that they don't see anyone else speaking to, or is telling stories that they otherwise don't get to relate to, they're going to care more about that rapper than an ordinary pop artist. Secondly, the rise of pop being fused with hip-hop is going to play a huge part in the industry's actions here. Unlike most of the 80s and 90s, your average everyday teenager is going to care deeply about the music and lives of these rappers. And let's not beat around the bush here. A lot of these rappers live lives that most of these average teenagers can't relate to. And that's because rap culture can often be so intertwined with gang culture, as unfortunate as that is. There are a lot more tragic and depressing stories of careers being ended in rap music than there are in pop music, for example. The combination of these massive, rabid audiences and these often brutal, heart-wrenching stories is dangerous for a sociopathic industry like music. The most famous example of this connection is the intertwined stories of late rappers the Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur, two rappers who are incredibly important to this topic as a whole. The stories behind their passing are in-depth and complicated, but the biggest takeaway is that East Coast and West Coast hip-hop had a rivalry that was growing to an uncontrollable level in the 90s, and the rappers' association with figures connected to crime rings and gangs in hip-hop eventually got them killed. Especially back then, hip-hop was a world unlike anything most of us, including myself, could ever imagine, so I won't bother giving any opinions or takes on the situation or the events that followed, just to avoid sounding ignorant. In terms of music, the depravity is more than apparent. Instead of one release which forsakes their legacy, their respective labels decided to milk these poor rappers' names until there was literally nothing left, and the labels themselves were names to be remembered. I mean, look at how many albums are released under these artists' names. And in classic, out-of-touch, corporate machine fashion, the naming and art of these albums gets more tone-deaf the farther you go. The ones closer to their deaths are obviously better, but you can tell after a certain point something is motivating them to release this music that isn't just the love of the craft. These albums started to suck bad. So, the stories that we're about to talk about really aren't a surprise after hearing about this. Juice WRLD, an artist who I personally have a pretty lengthy history with. I'm not really sure how it started, but all throughout middle school and high school, this guy consumed my Spotify account. I'm not kidding, the stats speak for themselves. And when he surprisingly died in 2019 to a drug overdose, I was a lot more affected by it than I thought I'd be, considering I had already started to distance myself from his music, like I talked about in this video. And a lot of individuals share my experience. This isn't 1984. We have the internet and people shared their emotions about it. Now, the story of his 2 posthumous releases are a little unique because it seemed to be a lot more in the control of the people around him than just the labels themselves. However, I do not doubt that Interscope and Grade A Records were pushing to release some of these 1,000 songs he apparently had. Because when a fan on SoundCloud, 999 World, leaked 26 of these tracks, non-profit, and out of love for his favorite rapper, Grade A were itching to intervene. And that's exactly what they did. After delaying a project that Juice was actually working on, titled The Outsiders, Grade A put out the album Legends Never Die, which was 22 unfinished tracks, one of which is an interlude track titled Juice WRLD Speaks from Heaven. It was by far Juice's biggest release. It debuted at #1 on Billboard, so I guess what else is there to do but release another one. But once again, it wasn't The Outsiders. It was another collection of unfinished tracks, this time of worse quality, with more bizarre, out-of-character features. It begs the question, why didn't they just release the one that Juice WRLD was actually working on? It would be unfinished either way. But that's where Juice's story ends for now. It's crazy to think that he started his studio career by rapping about losing his closest friends, and now his legacy gets torn apart like this. But that isn't where the industry has sank the lowest in recent times. I think we all know that Jared Higgins had a coworker and close friend who was treated infinitely worse after his passing. XXXTentacion, a story that many of us are probably already familiar with. Florida rapper José Onfroy was murdered in June of 2018 by way of armed robbery that ended with him being shot. The story is really sad, and it affects a lot of people, my age especially. He was leading the SoundCloud emo rap charge, so people were excited to see where he would go in the future. Now, we could blame the rappers that he was associated with for starting the trend, because he was featured on a fair few tracks after his passing, but it's hard to say when these songs were recorded, so it's not really worth our time. Where things get a little weird is in October of 2018. His manager, Solomon Sabandi, made the bold claim that X had at least 2 more albums of material, and they started this train by releasing a song that was by Skrillex with X's vocals just slapped in it. Such an insult. From that point on, X was puppeteered around like he was still alive. They were not going to let people forget how much potential this guy had. And I really would like to gloss over all of these releases, but I feel like it's necessary to list them off just so that we can all get a clear picture of what really happened here. Ghostbusters with Trippie Redd, Teardrop by Ugly God, a mixtape in collaboration with X by Sauce Waka, Falling Down with Lil Peep, Don't Cry with Lil Wayne, Arms Around You with Skrillex, a song with Lil Pump, Scared of the Dark off the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse soundtrack, and Run It Back with Craig Zen. Some of these songs are decent, and some of them may have even been recorded before he died, but it doesn't make it any easier to stomach. And by December 7th of 2018, his first posthumous album, Skins, was released, and people didn't really like it. To be fair, the people rating and reviewing this album never really liked X. He was not really that popular among critics, but still, you can tell this is worse. You can even find meat riders on his subreddit saying that this album has mistakes and isn't the best, which is a lot if you know anything about hip-hop and Reddit. And this isn't really a surprise considering the context. Empire Distribution, the company that he signed a deal with right before his passing, took control of his music in collaboration with José's estate. They made it clear, just days after his passing, that music would be getting out, and soon. And unlike a lot of our previous examples, they weren't even going to bother touching what X had done. After leaking a whole month early on Apple Music, it did eventually release on time, but it was 19 minutes long. The tracks are so short, and they're bizarre and unfinished, on purpose. Craziest part is, X's official DJ, DJ Scheme, leaked that Skins would not be his last posthumous album. Once again, Empire Distribution reached their hand into the cookie jar to release another cash-grabbing project. This time, it was one of the worst albums of the decade in a lot of people's opinions, and it continues to surprise new listeners to this day at the sheer shittiness. The song School Shooters, featuring a, to put it lightly, offensive verse from Lil Wayne, was enough to make most people turn it off. It's a total mess. The making of this album, unlike Skins, did require Empire to do a little bit of work to get the songs into a releasable state. But I want to emphasize just how much of a disaster the making of this project was. Pulled features from the already colossal list, canceled songs, promotional clothing lines, singles that push political sentiments on his behalf, they really could not get their act together. And this isn't me totally blaming Empire Distribution. X's estate is equally at fault here. This is just more of the same. Everyone involved in this situation used and abused the fans' emotional attachment to this artist. I do not care if X himself said he was going to release these albums. The way these songs sound discredits that entirely. And you know what? The same thing applies to Juice WRLD. What these examples emphasize over anything else is the lost potential that comes with some posthumous albums. To some extent, with Marvin Gaye or even with Michael Jackson, we were able to see the esteemed level of artistry and the elaborate visions they had play out. It's part of what made them have such a large, dedicated fan base in the first place. But for artists like Juice or X, fans were so attached to their stories because they were anticipating that elaborate show of creative genius. They were excited to be in on the next Michael Jackson or John Lennon. The labels freezing their creative development by releasing more music from their past is disgusting if you ask me. When these people see emotion in fans, they just interpret it as money to be made. In fact, this applies to all the examples that I've talked about so far, even the ones that I skipped over. Even if the outcome of these labels' greed is a decent album, it's almost always in spite of their true intentions. But sadly, these albums only get made because we stream them. But it's hard to really blame us. We're human. We want to hear evidence of people even after they're gone. Was I as objective as possible? No, probably not. The point I'm trying to make is that it's important to hold the industry accountable for their worst moments. These careers aren't really things that you can just mess up with and move on, considering one of the best options, if not the best option, is to always just do nothing, leave it alone. In any case, I hope you either learned something or, best case scenario, I got my point across. Either way, check out the live streams Tuesdays and Fridays, 2 p.m. EST, join the memberships, and that's about it. I'll see you later.
Well, this is what it looked like right before you fall.